Welcome to part 2 of the Rainforest build series, where I'll show you how I made the branches, foliage holders, and brought all the elements together to complete the enclosure upgrade for this girl right here, my Colombian Rainbow Boa Nymeria. Last time, we went through how I created the background with mossy rocks, a Colombian mahogany tree trunk, and foliage panels that filled in the empty wall space. If you haven't seen that one yet, it's definitely worth a look since it provides the foundation for everything in this video. But today we'll go through how I combined some methods I've used before, like shaping PVC for branches, with some newer techniques, like using epoxy clay to make those branches look much more realistic. I'll also review some of the particular choices I made for the arrangement based on Nymeria's leucism, which, for those of you who don't know, is what makes her look like this instead of this. I'll put a list of tools and materials and some non-affiliate links below for your reference, and I hope that this inspires you to try some new things out for yourself. You really can make caretaking an art form, and I consider it one of the many therapeutic aspects of having snakes as your companions. Art therapy is always great, but when it also supports the health and well-being of your animals, it's even better. Make sure you hit that like button and throw a comment down below if you enjoyed the video. Join the community on Discord, and please consider becoming a member on Patreon to support the channel. You can get early and ad-free access to episodes, extra content, community Zoom hangouts, and for those of you that join at the Boy Day level, I'm also offering some one-on-one consulting for enclosure builds, husbandry, and trust building advice, or whatever snake-related things you might want support with. And with all that out of the way, let's slither on into it. To start off my branches, I used PVC pipe, sanding down the surface a little to prepare it for adding clay. Make sure you wipe the pipes down with a wet rag to remove the dust afterwards. Using a heat gun, I started making bends in my PVC. If you want to see a more in-depth tutorial on how to do this, I'll link to that video in the description below. The branches in that video don't involve using epoxy clay, they're just shaped, given texture directly on the PVC, and then painted and sealed. If you go that route, just make sure you sand the pipes a bit more thoroughly for the paint to stick. I used a PVC base that had screw holes in it as my anchor point for the freestanding branch. This allowed me to play with the positioning and shape without permanently attaching it, and to work on it outside of the enclosure and then slip it into the fitting once it was complete. I attached a second identical footing to a 4x6 as a jig, giving me access to the entire thing without the sides of the enclosure getting in my way. I didn't make perfect compound cuts in the PVC because I knew the clay would fill in any gaps, but it was tricky to get things to hold at the angles I wanted. I ended up using hot glue and screws and even masking tape in order to attach the different branches together at first. I just needed to get my skeleton to stay put until the epoxy clay did its work to hold everything together. When I started these branches, I only had the standard 307 Zoopoxy on hand. My shipment of the 307 light version was delayed, and I wanted to keep working, so I used what I had until the light version arrived. There is a difference between the two products, and I much prefer the light version. The original is more brown in color, is heavier when it dries, and has a slightly different consistency. I find that texturing it is a bit more difficult. It almost seems sticky in comparison to the light version, but both work basically the same way. This branch was inspired by the ceiba tree, which has really fine lines and details in the bark. So I tried a number of different tools to try to recreate those lines, and ended up finding that a bristle brush worked best to get the desired result. Make sure to continuously rinse the brush in your water while you go so the clay doesn't build up on it. If the clay is too soft when you go to texture it, your brush may drag the clay with it, so you need to kind of find that sweet spot of when to start your texturing. This was my first attempt at anything like this, so I figured I'd try things out, and if I didn't like it, I could always add more clay on top and redo the texture later. I repeated the jig, glue, and screw process for the branch that would extend from the Colombian mahogany tree. I wasn't sure at this point if the branch would be permanently attached to the trunk of the tree later or not, but being able to remove it using that coupling I'd installed was so helpful. I put a heavier layer of clay on this branch since I would be using the bark stamp I used on the tree trunk to do the texture, and it needs some extra depth in order to leave an impression. To add a little extra life to the texture, I also used the bristle brush. I finally got my shipment of Zoopoxy light, and I used that for the rest of the build. As you can see, the color is different from the original version. They bond to each other and anything else, and the paint will cover up the difference in color. I decided to make the ceiba tree look more organic by building up the clay at the joints of the branches, as well as adding some little knots and gnarls along the stems. My favorite tool for the texture on the ceiba tree ended up being a wire tool that came in my clay tools kit. It was great for making lines in the surface, and I even used the butt of the tool for indents in the knots, which would end up being perfect places to mount foliage later. As you can see, the Zoopoxy light seemed to be easier to texture. It didn't stick to the tools as much as the regular version did. You definitely want to make sure that you carve deeply enough into the clay to allow paint to gather in the textures later, so don't be too shy with your tools. You'll notice that at this point, the ends of the branches are all left open. This is because I was still not sure how or where I wanted them to end, or if any of them would end up being attached to the ceiling or sides of the enclosure. They'd need to be closed off for sure, but I decided to wait until I had a better idea of how it would all fit together. It was time to do a dry fit and see how the branches worked with the background. This also allowed me to double check the ends of the branches and figure out if I needed to cut them down at all in order for the top to fit back on. I felt pretty happy with the layout, so it was time to put the branches back on their jigs and get to painting. The mahogany branch would have the same colors as its trunk, and if you watched part 1 of this series, you'll know the details of how I layered those colors, with a base coat of lighter brown and then washes of dark colors that flowed into the crevices created by the stamp tool. I tried to do this at the same time as I did the trunk, so I could use the same colors and make sure the tones were consistent. Then I added bits of white for lichen with a sponge brush and greens for moss with both brushes and sea sponges. The ceiba tree has much smoother bark than a mahogany, and much lighter colored bark. I started with a grayish tan color as my base coat, but once I added washes to flow into the textures, I felt like it was much darker than I wanted it to be. I should have started with the darker colors instead, so I ended up having more paint on this than I intended. I made sure the dark colors got into those crevices and lines, and then ended up dry brushing the lighter colors over top, dragging my brush perpendicular to the textures so the dark colors would stay in the crevices. I didn't really know what I was doing. I just kept looking at my reference images and tried a handful of different things until I got the results I wanted. These trees seem to have a significant amount of moss growing on them in the photos, and it was that green that really brought things to life. I used the dry brushing method for the moss, using both brushes and sea sponges, with a couple different shades of green that I mixed on the fly. As I mentioned in the first episode about the background of this enclosure, I always finish my pieces by sealing them with Eco Poly Clear Sealant. It'll not only protect your finish, but make cleaning a breeze. It's UV resistant, free of toxic VOCs, and a little goes a long way. Each coat dries within an hour and fully cures in 5 to 7 days. I love this product. Remember the footing I installed to receive the ceiba tree? I covered that in Zoopoxy, making sure to leave the inside of the coupling clear to receive the tree branch, and then did a little texturing and painting on that like I did for the branches. I knew it would be mostly buried under substrate, so I didn't get too detailed with it, but I took the side off the enclosure to make it easier to reach, and that really helped. Once the sculpting and painting was done, I did another dry fit to see how it all looked. Not bad. But we're not done yet. I wanted to add a lot of foliage in the canopy as well as on the ground. This would not only look more naturalistic and add visual barriers to make Nymeria feel safer, but would also help create a more dappled effect on the floor of the enclosure that mimicked a forest environment. This was especially important because Nymeria is leucistic, and the lack of melanin in her skin and her eyes means she's more sensitive to light than other snakes. I went online and bought a bunch of artificial plants. Pro tip, look for plants that people get to decorate their homes and offices. You'll get way more realistic looking plants and much more bang for your buck than you will if you buy plants marketed specifically for reptile enclosures. I started playing around with the open ends of some of the branches, hot gluing into the ends of the branches that would be visible through the window of the enclosure front. But I also needed to close up the ends of the branches that weren't getting plants, so it was time to take them out again so I could access them more easily. The knots I had made in the ceiba tree seemed like the perfect place to sprout some leaves, so I drilled holes in them to slip in some of the stems. I made the hole just big enough for the stem to fit in with a little resistance, so there was really no need for any glue. In order to seal up the pipes, I needed a little bit of stuffing before I capped them with Zoopoxy. Packing paper worked just fine for this. I don't know if I needed to hot glue it in, but I didn't want it to sink down while the clay was wet, so I did it anyway just for a bit of reinforcement. I added Zoopoxy to seal the open ends and to cover up the hot glue around the foliage. The ends of the open branches weren't really visible through the front opening because they were so close to the top or side of the enclosure, but I still wanted everything to look seamless. So I went ahead and textured and painted them to match the rest of the branches. I'm kind of a stickler for details. I repeated the process with the mahogany tree branch. For the floor of the enclosure, I decided to use PVC and Pex Pipe to mount my plants upright. I totally could have done this without using more clay. Substrate would be covering the majority of the pipe anyway. But again, I like details, and I wanted it to look as natural as possible. So I just made these weird little mounds. The clay would also give the bases more surface area to glue to the enclosure floor. I've tried using only the pipe, and I've found that it sometimes doesn't stay upright. So the wider the base, the better it sticks. And I figured a little Zoopoxy base would help. Again, you could probably get away without doing this. You could drill shallow holes in the floor of the enclosure and try to allow for more glue. You could rough up the bottoms of the pipe more, but this is just how I did it. I didn't end up using all of these, so I have some for another build. By trimming some of the stems, I hope to not have to use glue to keep the leaves in place. I spent a while playing around with the arrangement of the foliage. I didn't want to block the view of the background completely, but I did want to make sure it created the cover and clutter that would be beneficial for Nymeria. I ended up deciding not to permanently attach the mahogany branch to the trunk, but I definitely wanted to hide the eyesore of the coupling. The foliage panels I got for the background were a perfect resource. The pieces pop off the plastic frame, so after painting it brown, I glued some of them around the base of the branch and voila, no more eyesore. And the branch is still removable if I so desire. Once I decided where to put my plants, I used silicone to secure their little mounts to the enclosure floor. Silicone doesn't love PVC, so if I ever did want to remove them, it wouldn't be that difficult to do so. That being said, without that wider base I gave them, they would probably not have stayed in place with just silicone. For the larger leaves, I wanted to add them underneath where the brightest light would be so that Nymeria wouldn't be overly exposed. Those plastic plants are easily bendable, and once secured, I could play around with their arrangement a little more. If she really wanted full light and heat exposure, she could climb onto the ledge of the rock or the branches, but I've never seen her do that, and she's seemed averse to direct sunlight when I've taken her outside. The grass piece I put in the front was just to add an extra visual barrier. I continued by securing the leaves in the canopy. I found some fake Spanish moss that added a nice little accent to wind around and hang from the branches as well. If I felt like the leaves needed a bit of help staying in the holder, I added hot glue into the hole before putting them in, but most of them stayed put just fine without it. These ferns were my absolute favorites that I bought. I'll definitely be getting more of those. People ask me a lot why I don't use real plants, and I actually usually do have a few live plants in my enclosures, but I like fake plants because I can choose where they go and I don't have to worry about them dying or being crushed or dug up by the snakes. Of course, there is a risk of melting them if you place them too close to a heat source, but you can most certainly place them much closer to heat lamps than you could real plants, whose leaves might shrivel or burn if they're too close. I also like that I can choose dynamic ranges of plants if I go artificial. I certainly wouldn't have been able to find or fit a real Colombian mahogany tree in this enclosure, and I love ferns, but I always kill them inadvertently, and the bird of paradise leaves wouldn't have fit in a 2-foot tall enclosure. So for me, fake plants work. I measured out where the branches were before attaching my lamps to the top. I always end up moving things around a little once the top is on, but it's way harder to do the layout from inside the enclosure. So having the top off for this was really helpful. For the first go, I just taped the fixtures in place so I could do a test fit without drilling all of my attachments into place. Once I tested things, I could pull the top back off to do my final attachments without having to work around all the branches and stuff on the inside. If you've ever wondered about what type of heat lamps you should use and how to arrange your lighting best, I just recently recorded a presentation on a live stream all about that, and I'll link to the recording of it here. That stuff can be really confusing, so walking through some of the science-based research I did on it seemed to be helpful for a lot of people. The last step in the process was putting the substrate in and running the lamps to check temperatures and humidity levels over the course of several days. I tried out several different heat bulbs to find the one that worked best in combination with the LEDs and the UVB to provide the right gradient across the enclosure. I was also able to verify that the dappled light effect was working out, and that the rock background and branches helped to hold and release some of the heat into the evenings once all the lights shut off. Time for the best part, getting it set up in the snake room and adding the final bits like water bowl, hides, and extra clutter. I actually added one real cork branch at the very end, and it was pretty cool to see how closely it resembled the mahogany I made. It's almost impossible to tell that one is real and one is handmade. Nymeria was in shed when I finished up, so I knew she wouldn't be exploring right away. It was probably a little confusing for her to go into a new environment when she couldn't really see, but it wasn't hard for her to find some good places to hide and ride out her shed cycle. I was pretty happy with how everything turned out, but I'd have to be patient to see how she felt about all of it. Neither of us was disappointed. The first night she started exploring was one of the happiest moments I've had in a while. And not only did she have a perfect shed and take a meal without issue right away, she now spends every night lounging up in the branches I made for her. She didn't lounge like this in her old enclosure. She seems extremely relaxed and uses the entire gradient during the daytime too, which are all signs of a happy snake. I treated this enclosure as a work of art, and I poured my heart and soul into it, but it was her opinion of it that truly proved it was a success. Watching her use what I worked so hard on to make for her has been indescribably rewarding. I love how it looks in the snake room, but the joy really hits hardest when I see her out and about every night enjoying it. That is truly snake therapy. I hope for nothing more than to inspire you to have fun exploring creative ways to give just a little bit more to your animals. When you're designing, be sure to think about how the elements and layout will benefit the particular animal you're creating it for. Take some time to think about their native habitat so you can encourage positive natural behaviors and maximize the usable space in their enclosure. Even if you take just a few ideas from what I did here, you'll be adding enrichment that your reptile wouldn't otherwise be getting, and have a more aesthetically pleasing enclosure. If they use it in a healthy way and you enjoy looking at it, then you should feel really good about whatever you end up making. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button before you go, and we'll see you next time for more snake therapy.